Look at the person sitting across from you. Notice the microexpressions, the subtle downward pull of the lip corners, the slight tension in the jaw, the way their breathing pattern shifts when a specific topic is introduced. For most people, these are invisible data points. For you, they are an overwhelming flood of raw data that slams into your nervous system every single second of every single day. You have been told your entire life that you feel too much. You've been labeled sensitive. You've been treated like a fragile instrument that breaks under the pressure of a harsh world. That is the single greatest lie you have ever accepted. What if I told you that what you call being an empath isn't an emotional defect? What if I proved to you right now that it is actually an uncalibrated human radar system? Right now, your radar is spinning out of control. It's picking up everyone else's anxiety, everyone else's hidden malice, everyone else's insecurity, and it is routing that data straight into your own chest. It drains you. It makes you easy to isolate, easy to manipulate, and easy to exploit by people who possess a completely different kind of psychological profile. You are the premium target for the wolves of the world because you provide an endless supply of emotional fuel. But something shifted recently. You can feel it. The exhausting loops aren't working the way they used to. The old traps are starting to look glaringly obvious. You are standing on the absolute precipice of the largest psychological pivot of your existence. You are about to weaponize the exact trait that used to break you. In the next few minutes, we are going to dismantle the mechanics of how you've been perceived, and more importantly, how you perceive yourself. I am going to show you the exact behavioral metrics that signal the end of your era as a target and the beginning of your absolute dominance. If you walk away from this room right now, you will keep running the old software. You will keep absorbing the venom of every broken person you try to fix. But if you stay, if you look at the cold, hard mechanics of behavioral psychology, you will learn how to turn that radar outward, not as a sponge, but as a map. You will learn the exact operational shift that turns a target into the most formidable authority in the room. This is the blueprint for the biggest comeback of your life. Pay attention to the shifts, because once you see the matrix of human behavior clearly, you can never be manipulated again. The human baseline is incredibly easy to read if you know what to look for. Most people walk into a room and see faces, clothes, and movement. When you walk into a room, you see an unspoken battlefield of hidden agendas, masked insecurities, and suppressed trauma. You don't just see it, you breathe it in. For years, this has been your prison. You have operated under the assumption that because you can feel the pain of others, it is your responsibility to cure it. You've allowed toxic personalities to anchor themselves to your energy because you thought your empathy was a bridge. It wasn't a bridge. It was an open invitation. But the data is changing. The behavioral patterns you are exhibiting right now show all the classic markers of a system reset. The compliance loops are breaking. The tolerance for psychological incongruence, people whose words don't match their micro-expressions, has dropped to zero. You are entering the comeback phase, not because the world got nicer, but because you are finally learning how to calibrate your instrument. Let's talk about the mechanics of this comeback. First, we establish operational detachment. True empathy is not about feeling with someone. It is about accurately reading the data of what they are experiencing. When a sniper reads the wind, he doesn't become the wind. He adjusts his scope. From this day forward, you stop absorbing the emotional frequency of the room. You observe it. When someone enters your space with chaotic, manipulative, or aggressive energy, your heart rate should not spike. Your analytical mind should activate. You treat their behavior as a biometric readout. The moment you shift from feeling their manipulation to mapping it, their power over you evaporates entirely. Second, understand the power of the pause. Manipulative personalities rely on speed. They want to trigger your empathy quickly to force a compliant response. The comeback empath utilizes a deliberate, controlled lag in communication. When an emotional demand is made of you, you do not immediately offer comfort or validation. You hold eye contact. You let 3 seconds of dead silence pass. In human dynamics, the person who can sit comfortably in silence holds the psychological high ground. Watch how their blinking rate increases. Watch how they begin to fidget. You have just inverted the power dynamic without saying a single word. Third, we implement systemic boundary calibration. Up until now, your boundaries have been reactive. You only set them when you were completely drained and desperate. That is a defensive posture. The comeback requires an offensive posture. You establish your boundaries when you are at your strongest. You define the terms of engagement clearly, coldly, and without emotional justification. You do not explain why you have a boundary. An explanation is a subconscious plea for permission. You state the boundary as a fact of nature, like gravity. The people who are used to the old version of you will call this new phase cold. They will call it calculated. They will claim you've changed. They are absolutely right. You are transitioning from a passive collector of human suffering into an active analyst of human behavior. You are no longer the asset that can be drained. You are the authority that must be respected. The wolves in your life are going to realize very quickly that the radar they use to exploit has now become a targeting system that spots their maneuvers long before they even attempt them. Look at your hands. Feel the pulse in your wrists. Your nervous system was designed for high-level acuity, not high-level anxiety. Adjust your scope. Calibrate your radar. Secure your perimeter. The era of your exploitation is officially over. Welcome to the greatest psychological comeback of your life. The human nervous system is an incredibly complex receiver of data. Yet the vast majority of the population walks through life completely blind to the silent broadcasts of those around them. They miss the sudden, sharp intake of breath when a sensitive topic is broached. They fail to register the asymmetrical tension in a colleague's shoulders or the slight vocal pitch shift that indicates a hidden agenda. For the individual labeled as an empath, however, these signals are not missed. They are gathered instantly, continuously, and with agonizing clarity. The fundamental tragedy of the uncalibrated empath is that they have been conditioned to interpret this profound analytical capability as an emotional vulnerability. You have been taught that your hyper-awareness of the human landscape is a fragile trait, a soft spot in your psychological armor that leaves you perpetually exposed to the whims, the traumas, and the chaotic energies of the room. This misinterpretation is precisely what leaves you open to the predatory reversal, a mechanism where manipulative individuals instinctively identify your heightened sensitivity and use it to anchor their own psychological weight onto your existence. They recognize that you possess an innate drive to harmonize environment disruptions, and they exploit that drive by creating controlled chaos for you to fix. The first and most critical step of your psychological comeback requires a brutal, systematic reframing of this entire dynamic. What you have historically misdiagnosed as an emotional defect or a spiritual burden is in reality a highly sophisticated, uncalibrated radar system. It is raw, unfiltered intelligence gathering. When you walk into an environment and feel an immediate heavy shift in your chest, that is not a sign that you are weak or overly sensitive. It is a highly accurate biometric readout indicating that the room is populated by psychological incongruence. The data itself is neutral. The error occurs in your internal routing system. Currently, your radar is configured to pull that external data directly into your own emotional processing unit, forcing you to subjectively experience the anxiety, the anger, or the deceit of another person. The comeback begins the exact second you intercept that data at the perimeter and reroute it to your analytical mind. Imagine a sophisticated military radar array. When it detects an incoming threat or a localized anomaly, the system does not absorb the impact of the anomaly. It maps its trajectory, calculates its velocity, and assesses its intent. It remains entirely separate from the target it is observing. This is the precise operational shift you must execute. You must transform your empathy from a passive sponge into an active, weaponized observation tool. The moment you perceive someone's hidden malice, their desperate need for control, or their masked insecurity, your internal response should not be a surge of defensive anxiety. It should be a cold, calculated realization. My system has just mapped their baseline. By separating your personal emotional state from the data you are receiving, you instantly strip the predatory reversal of its power. The manipulator relies entirely on your willingness to internalize their broadcasted distress. When you refuse to absorb it and instead use that data to quietly analyze the behavioral patterns, you shift from the hunted to the observer. You are no longer a target reacting to their moves. You are the only person in the room who truly understands the mechanics of why they are moving in the first place, giving you an unassailable psychological advantage. The strategic manipulation of human behavior almost always relies on the distortion of time and momentum. When a high-level manipulator, a toxic colleague, or a demanding family member seeks to exploit your empathic nature, they rarely do so with a slow, transparent buildup. Instead, they weaponize speed, creating a false sense of urgency designed to bypass your cognitive defenses and strike directly at your instinctual desire to soothe, fix, or validate. This behavioral trap operates on an accelerated loop. They project a sudden wave of emotional distress, manufactured chaos, or passive-aggressive pressure, and they count on your uncalibrated system to instantly rush forward to absorb that discomfort. They need you to react before you can analyze. This is because they know that if you are given even a brief window to process the interaction objectively, you will notice the glaring flaws in their narrative, the micro-expressions of entitlement across their face, or the predatory nature of their demands. They force a fast tempo to keep you trapped in a defensive, reactive posture, turning your natural responsiveness into a compliance mechanism that operates entirely on their timeline. To execute a definitive psychological comeback, you must master the anatomy of the trap and introduce its absolute antidote, the deliberate, controlled use of the tactical pause. In the architecture of human dynamics, the individual who controls the tempo of an interaction controls the power balance of the room. When an emotional demand is hurled at you, or when someone attempts to bait you into a defensive argument, your historical baseline has been an immediate, urgent reply, an attempt to clear the air or defend your character. You must completely invert this pattern. When the bait is dropped, you do not move. You do not speak. You do not adjust your posture. Instead, you hold steady, unbroken eye contact and let a minimum of 3 to 4 seconds of dead silence sit heavily between you. This is not a passive freeze response. It is an active operational delay that completely disrupts the manipulator's psychological momentum. During this intentional silence, a fascinating physiological shift occurs in the room. The person attempting to manipulate you has structured their entire approach around receiving an immediate emotional payoff, whether that payoff is your compliance, your anxiety, or your defensive explanation. When they hit a wall of absolute silence, their brain experiences a severe cognitive dissonance. Watch their metrics closely during these seconds. You will see their blinking rate spike as their brain tries to calculate why their simulation failed. You will see subtle microtensions form around their jaw or a sudden nervous adjustment of their posture. By refusing to feed the loop with immediate words, you force them to sit in the discomfort they attempted to project onto you. Furthermore, this pause serves as your personal calibration window. In those few seconds of silence, you are not drowning in their emotional noise. You are evaluating their delivery, mapping their desperation, and deciding precisely how to dismantle their position. You are reclaiming the psychological high ground by demonstrating that your words, your attention, and your emotional energy cannot be extorted through manufactured urgency, effectively shifting the command of the entire interaction entirely into your hands. Every major systemic shift in human behavior is preceded by a subtle internal recalibration of how data is filtered and processed. For an individual who has spent a lifetime navigating the world with heightened sensitivity, the transition point, the definitive catalyst for the comeback, does not manifest as a sudden, loud burst of outward aggression or a dramatic confrontation. Instead, it begins as a quiet, chilling realization that occurs deep within the architecture of your observation system. It is the precise moment you shift from the agonizing process of passive emotional absorption to the cold, clinical execution of active behavioral observation. Up until this pivot point, your internal software has been configured to internalize the environment, treating every spike in room tension, every unexpressed pocket of resentment, and every manipulative undertone as a personal problem that you are obligated to solve or cushion. The transition point occurs when the sheer exhaustion of carrying that uncalibrated weight forces a structural collapse of the old compliance loops, allowing a new analytical operating system to come online in its place. When this shift occurs, the way you read human interaction changes fundamentally and permanently. You no longer walk into an environment wondering how people feel about you or what you can do to make the dynamic smoother. Instead, you sit back and quietly map the behavioral metrics of everyone in the space. You begin to notice the stark, undeniable gap between a person's spoken words and their physiological baseline. When a toxic individual attempts to use the exact same emotional triggers that used to send your anxiety spiking, you find that your heart rate remains entirely flat. You watch their performance not from the stage where you are trapped in the scene with them, but from the darkness of the theater seats, observing the mechanics of their script. This sudden drop in your emotional reactivity is the ultimate warning sign to those who are used to exploiting your energy. They will notice that the subtle guilt trips no longer yield an apology. The passive-aggressive sighs no longer provoke a comforting response, and the manufactured crises no longer cause you to drop your own priorities to rescue them. This phase of the comeback is highly disruptive to the existing hierarchy of your relationships because it strips away the predictability that manipulators rely on. A behavioral predator requires a predictable, reactive target to maintain their dominant position. The moment you become an unpredictable, silent observer, the power dynamic instantly flips. You are now tracking their micro-expressions, measuring their vocal pacing, and recognizing their desperation long before they even finish speaking. This transition point is the exact boundary line where you cease to be a baseline resource for other people's emotional dumping and instead become the most formidable, unreadable presence in the room. You are finally recognizing that the ability to perceive everything is not a mandate to fix everything, and that true psychological authority belongs to the person who sees the entire matrix of behavior but refuses to let it alter their own internal state. The true baseline of psychological survival for a highly sensitive individual rests entirely on the execution of operational detachment. This is the tactical discipline of decoupling your internal state from the external variables of your environment. For years, your primary error has been the belief that to remain an authentic, empathetic human being, you must keep your nervous system completely porous, allowing the emotional runoff of every broken, aggressive, or chaotic individual to flood your personal space. Operational detachment is the structural correction of that flaw. It is the realization that you can possess an incredibly high-resolution map of someone else's emotional terrain without setting foot on the territory yourself. When a scout surveys an enemy position, he documents the terrain, maps the obstacles, and notes the movement patterns, but he does not absorb the mud or the concrete into his own physical form. He remains entirely separate, maintaining a clean, uncompromised perspective so he can make calculated decisions. You must begin to treat the emotional distress, the manipulation tactics, and the psychological warfare of others with that exact same level of clinical, professional distance. Achieving this level of detachment requires a deliberate, cognitive rewiring of how you perceive incoming stimuli. When someone enters your space throwing an emotional tantrum or trying to project a wave of toxic guilt onto you, your historical response has been a somatic reaction. Your stomach tightens, your breathing shallows, and your mind immediately scrambles to find a way to neutralize the threat. Operational detachment demands that you consciously shift this reaction from a somatic response to a biometric assessment. The moment the attack begins, you mentally step back behind a layer of ballistic glass. You do not engage with the emotional content of their words. Instead, you analyze the mechanics of their delivery. You listen to the pitch of their voice. You count the frequency of their projections, and you identify the exact behavioral script they are running. By treating their behavior as a set of cold data points, you create a psychological buffer zone that prevents their emotional frequency from penetrating your perimeter. This operational shift completely neutralizes the primary weapon of the behavioral predator. A manipulator relies on your emotional resonance. They need your anxiety to spike in tandem with theirs so they can guide your behavior. When they encounter an individual who can look them directly in the eyes, accurately read every hidden motive, and yet maintain a completely flat, unaffected physiological baseline, their entire strategy implodes. They are left shouting into an empty canyon, receiving absolutely no echo, no compliance, and no emotional fuel. You are not shutting down your ability to perceive. You are simply shutting down your vulnerability to being infected. This discipline transforms you into an incredibly formidable presence, because a person who cannot be emotionally leveraged is a person who cannot be controlled, turning your radar into a cold weapon of pure situational awareness. The final defining phase of your psychological emergence rests on the execution of a total authority shift. In any given human interaction, an invisible, unspoken negotiation occurs within the first few seconds of engagement to determine who holds the dominant psychological position in the room. Historically, your uncalibrated empathy forced you to default to a submissive or hyper-accommodating posture. You walked into spaces actively modifying your body language, softening your vocal tones, and offering premature validation just to keep the social peace and avoid friction. This submissive baseline is a beacon for behavioral predators. It signals to them that your boundaries are highly elastic and that you value the comfort of others over your own psychological sovereignty. The authority shift occurs when you permanently dismantle this behavioral pattern and replace it with the unmistakable metrics of an unshakable, self-contained anchor. You stop asking for permission to occupy space, and you stop apologizing for the reality of your presence. Executing this shift requires the deliberate application of high-authority behavioral metrics. The first metric is the stabilization of your physical baseline. When a highly manipulative or aggressive individual attempts to project tension into the environment, your body must remain entirely still and balanced. You eliminate all low-authority tells, the nervous shifting of weight, the frequent micro-nods of agreement, and the rapid, shallow breathing patterns that signal a system under stress. Your movements become slow, deliberate, and entirely economical. The second metric is the recalibration of your vocal delivery. You speak from a lower register, dropping the upward inflections at the end of your sentences that make statements sound like questions. You speak with a flat, calm certainty, allowing your words to sit in the air without rushing to fill the gaps or soften the blow. When you speak with this level of structural weight, the psychological center of gravity in the room instantly shifts toward you. The third metric of the authority shift is the absolute refusal to justify, argue, defend, or explain your decisions. When you tell a toxic individual no, or when you establish a firm boundary, the old version of you would immediately follow it with a lengthy explanation, trying to make them understand your perspective. A manipulator views an explanation as a soft entry point, a sign that your decision is still open for negotiation or emotional extortion. The high-authority empath states the boundary as an objective, unalterable fact, and then they stop talking. They allow the silence to put the pressure back on the other person. This complete inversion of the power dynamic forces the wolves and the emotional parasites in your life into a harsh realization. The person they used to exploit has evolved into the most formidable authority in their environment.